Sometimes the things we inherit aren't meant to be sold or forgotten. They're meant to be honored. When Elías Navarro returns to his grandfather's crumbling adobe homestead in New Mexico, all that's left is dust and fading memories. The townspeople laugh when he vows to restore it by hand. They call him a fool chasing ghosts. But Elías isn't rebuilding walls. He's rebuilding what was truly lost. Hidden in old crates, he discovers his abuelo's plans, revealing something unexpected, a vision that could bring an entire community back from disappearing. What he creates from dirt and dreams will leave everyone standing in silence. What could one cowboy build that would silence an entire town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The drive from Wyoming had taken 3 days, and Elías Navarro felt every one of those miles in his bones. At 59, the body kept a ledger of long nights and hard work, and right now that ledger was demanding payment. His truck, a 1997 Ford that had seen better decades, coughed as he turned off the highway onto the dirt road leading to what had once been his grandfather's land. What would soon be his land, if the paperwork he'd signed in Albuquerque meant anything? The landscape hadn't changed. New Mexico in late April held the same stark beauty he remembered from childhood. Endless sky, the color of faded denim, red earth that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun, and mountains in the distance that looked close enough to touch, but never were. Juniper and pinon dotted the hills, their twisted shapes familiar as old friends. The air through his open window carried the scent of sage and dust, and something deeper he couldn't name. Memory, maybe, or regret. The homestead appeared around a bend in the road, and Elías had to stop the truck. He'd prepared himself for ruin, but seeing it was different from imagining it. The main house, if you could still call it that, leaned to one side like an old man favoring a bad hip. Adobe walls that had once stood proud and solid were cracked and crumbling. Whole sections collapsed into piles of sun-baked clay. The roof was mostly gone, wooden vigas exposed to the sky like ribs picked clean. Weeds and desert grass had reclaimed the courtyard. A cottonwood tree his grandfather had planted grew wild and untended, its branches reaching toward the broken walls as if trying to hold them up. 2 smaller structures flanked the main house, both in similar states of decay. Windows gaped empty, glass long gone. Doors hung crooked on rusted hinges. The whole place looked like something from a ghost story, and maybe it was. The ghosts were certainly here. Elías could feel them the moment he stepped out of the truck. He stood there for a long time, just looking. The heat pressed down on his shoulders, and sweat traced lines down his weathered face. His hands, calloused and scarred from decades of ranch work, hung loose at his sides. What had he been thinking? That he could bring this place back from the dead? That he could undo 30 years of neglect and weather and time itself? But he'd driven 3 days to get here. He'd sold everything he owned that wasn't in the truck bed. He'd made promises to a man who'd been dead for 15 years, promises spoken out loud in a motel room in Cheyenne while rain hammered the windows. Turning back wasn't an option, even if it would have been the smart thing to do. The village of Tierra Antigua sat 2 miles down the road, a collection of adobe buildings and mobile homes that had somehow survived the exodus that had emptied so many rural places. Population 300, maybe less. Elías had stopped there first, at the hardware store that doubled as the post office and the only place to buy groceries for 20 miles. The owner, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Benny Cordova, had looked at him with open skepticism when Elías explained his plans. "You're going to restore the old Navarro place? By yourself?" "That's the idea." Benny had laughed, not unkindly, but not kindly either. "No offense, but that place has been falling down since before you were born. Your grandfather tried to keep it up, but after the family left," he'd shrugged, the gesture saying everything words couldn't. "Takes more than one man to fight the desert. The desert always wins." Elías had bought what supplies he could afford, some basic tools, a tarp, bottled water, canned food, and asked about people who might remember his grandfather. Benny had mentioned Doña Carmen. who lived in the house behind the church, and Father Miguel, the young priest from Santa Fe, who said Mass twice a week. The church was easy to find, a small adobe building with a wooden cross above the door, painted white but peeling. An older woman was sweeping the steps, her movements slow but steady. She wore a faded blue dress and had her grey hair pulled back in a bun. When Elías introduced himself, her face softened. "Tomás Navarro's grandson," she'd said, "not a question. I see him in your face. You have his eyes." Doña Carmen had invited him inside for coffee, and they'd sat in the cool dimness of the church sacristy while she told him what she remembered. His grandfather had been a good man, she said, proud but not arrogant, skilled with his hands. He'd built that homestead in 1948, right after coming back from the war, the Second World War, she clarified, as if Elías might have lost track of which wars his grandfather had fought in. He wanted to bring his family together, Doña Carmen had said, stirring sugar into her coffee. All of them from Mexico and from the different places they'd scattered to. He built those houses, 3 of them, you know, so there would be room for everyone. But people don't always want what's good for them. They want what's new, what's far away. Your father left for Albuquerque. His brothers went to California. And Tomás, he stayed here with his dreams and his empty houses. She'd looked at Elías with eyes that missed nothing. "Why are you here, mijo? Why now?" Elías hadn't had a good answer then, and he didn't have one now as he walked through the ruins of his grandfather's dreams. Because he had nowhere else to go. Because 15 years of drifting from ranch to ranch, living in bunkhouses and cheap motels, had finally worn him down to nothing. Because his marriage had ended badly, and his daughter wouldn't return his calls, and he'd become the kind of man who could disappear for months, and nobody would notice. Or maybe because he owed it to the old man who'd taught him to ride, who'd let him spend summers here when his parents were fighting, who'd never said a word of reproach when Elías had left at 18 and barely visited after that. The truth was, probably all of those things, and none of them. Elías had learned that life rarely offered simple reasons for complicated decisions. He set up camp in what had been the stable, one of the few structures with a mostly intact roof. The space smelled of old hay and animal musk and thyme. He spread his bedroll on the packed earth floor, hung a battery-powered lantern from a nail, and arranged his few possessions with the careful precision of a man who'd lived out of a duffel bag for years. That first night, after a cold dinner of canned beans and stale bread, Elías sat with his back against the stable wall and opened the leather journal he'd found in his grandfather's things after the funeral. His mother had given it to him. "Your abuelo would want you to have this." But Elías had never looked at it, hadn't been able to, or maybe hadn't wanted to. Now, with the desert night pressing close and coyotes calling in the distance, he finally read the words his grandfather had written decades ago. The journal was filled with daily entries, written in careful Spanish with occasional English words mixed in. Tomás Navarro had documented his life, the weather, the work, small observations about the land and animals. But scattered throughout were passages that cut deeper. "Another letter from Roberto today," one entry read. "He says the job in Albuquerque is going well, that the children are in good schools. He does not say when they will visit. I do not ask. A man cannot force his children to love what he loves, to value what he values. But I keep the rooms ready. Someday they will understand what this place means, what it was built to be." Further on, "Finish the window frames for the second house today." Miguel laughed when I told him I'm building for grandchildren I haven't met yet. He thinks I'm a foolish old man. Maybe I am. But what else is there to do with the time I have? A house is not just walls and roof. It is a promise, a place to return to. Everyone needs that, whether they know it or not. And later, in handwriting that wavered with age, Roberto called. Says he cannot come for Christmas. Too much work, too expensive. The children have school events. I understand. I do. But the houses stand empty and I'm tired. What is the point of building something no one wants? Maybe Miguel was right. Maybe I should have been content with less, with just one small house for one old man. But that was never the dream. The dream was family, The dream was belonging. The dream was everyone together in the place our ancestors came from, keeping the language alive, keeping the traditions alive, keeping each other close. How do you let go of a dream like that? Elias had to stop reading. The lantern light blurred, and he realized his eyes were wet. He hadn't cried in years. Not when his marriage ended, not when his daughter screamed at him that he'd never been a real father, not even at his grandfather's funeral. But here, in this broken place, surrounded by the ruins of someone else's hope, the tears came. His grandfather had died alone. That fact lived in Elias like a stone in his chest. Tomás Navarro had spent his final years in a house too big for one person, tending a homestead no one cared about, waiting for a family that never came back. And Elias, who'd been working a ranch in Montana at the time, hadn't made it to the funeral. Couldn't afford the plane ticket, he'd told himself. Work obligations, he'd said. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He'd been afraid to face what he'd helped destroy through his absence. His daughter Maria was 32 now. She had children of her own, a girl and a boy he'd heard through his ex-wife, but Elias had never met them. 5 years since he'd last spoken to Maria, after a phone call that had ended with her saying she was done, that he could drift through life alone, since that's clearly what he wanted. "You're just like him," she'd said, meaning Elias's own father, the man who'd left this homestead and never looked back. "You're just like him, and I won't do this anymore." She'd been right. That was the worst part. Elias had spent his whole life running from anything that required him to stay, to commit, to be present. And now he was 59 years old, with nothing to show for it except truck payments and the kind of loneliness that sits in your bones. The coyotes called again, closer now. Elias closed the journal and set it carefully aside. Tomorrow he would begin. He didn't know how to build with adobe, didn't know if the structures could even be salvaged or if he'd have to start from nothing. Didn't know if he had enough money to buy materials or enough strength left in his aging body to do the work. But his grandfather had built this place with his own hands, starting from nothing but dirt and hope. If Tomás Navarro could do that, then his grandson could at least try to put it back together. Father Miguel had stopped by late in the afternoon, a young man in his 30s with kind eyes and easy manner. He'd picked his way through the debris to where Elias was sorting through rubble, separating salvageable materials from trash. "Doña Carmen told me you were here," the priest had said. "I wanted to welcome you and to offer any help I can." They'd talked for a while about the homestead and the village and what remained of the old families. Father Miguel had listened more than he talked, which Elias appreciated. Too many people felt the need to fill silence with empty words. Before leaving, the priest had said something that stuck with Elias. "Sometimes we have to go backward to move forward. Sometimes we have to rebuild what was broken before we can build something new." There's no shame in that. It's not living in the past. It's honoring it so the future has something solid to stand on. Now, lying in his bedroll with the desert night cool against his skin, Elias thought about those words, honor. That was what this was about. Not bringing back something dead, but honoring what had been built, what had been dreamed, what had been offered and refused and left to crumble. His grandfather's journal lay beside him, leather worn soft by handling. Inside those pages was a map of a life lived with intention, with purpose, with a vision that had outlasted the man himself. Tomás Navarro had built these houses as an act of faith, faith that family mattered, that tradition had value, that some things were worth preserving even when the world moved on. Elias could honor that. Maybe couldn't fulfill it, maybe couldn't bring the family back or restore what had been lost. But he could honor the attempt. He could rebuild these walls and make them solid again. He could take the broken pieces of his grandfather's dream and put them back together, even if no one ever lived here but him. It wasn't redemption exactly, but it was something. A way forward that looked backward, a path that led home, even though home was just dust and memories and a leather journal full of a dead man's hopes. Tomorrow, the work would begin. Tomorrow, Elías Navarro would start putting his hands to the same earth his grandfather had shaped. and see if anything could grow from ground that had lain fallow for so long. Outside, the coyotes sang their ancient songs to the stars, and the wind moved through the broken walls like breath through a body that refused to die. The morning came early, the way mornings do in the desert. Elías woke to find sunlight streaming through the gaps in the stable walls, painting stripes across his bedroll. His back protested as he stood, muscles stiff from sleeping on the ground and yesterday's drive. But there was work to do, and pain was just part of the bargain a man made with age. He started with the main house, or what remained of it. The structure leaned precariously, and Elías moved carefully through the debris, testing each step before committing his weight. Broken pottery crunched under his boots. Fragments of furniture, a chair leg, part of a table, lay scattered like bones. The walls that still stood bore traces of their former life. Nail holes where pictures had hung, darker squares where shelves had been, the faint outline of a window frame. In what had been the main room, a section of roof had collapsed inward, creating a pile of vigas, latillas, and dried mud. Elías began moving the debris piece by piece, sorting anything that might be salvageable. Some of the wooden beams were still solid, the old-growth ponderosa pine dense and strong, despite decades of exposure. Others had rotted through or been eaten by insects, their centers soft as powder. Beneath the collapsed roof, he found crates. 3 of them, wooden boxes weathered gray but intact. They'd been protected by the debris, shielded from the worst of the weather. Elías dragged them out into the courtyard where the light was better and pried off the first lid. Inside, papers yellowed with age, wrapped in oilcloth. Documents, deeds, receipts from 70 years ago. A marriage certificate, birth certificates for children. The paper trail of a family's life, carefully preserved and then forgotten. Elías set them aside, made a mental note to go through them properly later. The second crate held household items, tools, dishes wrapped in newspaper from 1962, a coffee grinder, candles. The mundane objects people accumulated, things they thought they'd need, but never used. Elías picked up the coffee grinder, turned the handle. It still worked, the mechanism smooth despite the years. He set it aside to keep. The third crate was sealed with wax. Someone had taken care to protect its contents, to ensure that time and moisture wouldn't penetrate. Elías used his knife to break the seal, worked the lid free with a crowbar. The wood groaned, but gave way. Inside, wrapped in canvas and tied with twine, were rolls of paper. Large sheets carefully protected. Elías's hands trembled slightly as he untied the twine and unrolled the first sheet, blueprints. Architectural drawings done by hand in careful pen and ink. His grandfather's handwriting labeled each element in Spanish, sala, cocina, dormitorio. But these weren't plans for a single house. Elías spread the sheets across the ground, weighing down the corners with rocks, and stared at what his grandfather had designed. 3 structures arranged in a U-shape around a central courtyard. Each building was a complete home. Living areas, kitchens, bedrooms, bathrooms. They were connected by covered walkways, their walls sharing a common boundary. The courtyard in the center held space for a garden, a fountain, gathering areas under ramadas. Along the edges, his grandfather had drawn trees and plants, noting their names and purposes. In the bottom corner of the main blueprint, in careful script, para mis hijos y los hijos de mis hijos, que siempre tengan un lugar para regresar, for my children and my children's children, may they always have a place to return to. The date, Marzo 1947, March 1947. His grandfather had designed this before he'd even broken ground, had envisioned the entire compound as it was meant to be. And he'd built it, or started to. Elías looked up at the 3 structures surrounding him. They matched the blueprints, placed exactly as drawn, sized exactly as planned. His grandfather had completed the buildings, but the family had never filled them. Elías sat back on his heels, blueprint in his hands, and felt something crack open in his chest. This wasn't just a house. It had never been just a house. His grandfather had built a haven, a gathering place, a physical manifestation of his belief that families should stay together. 3 homes, so that 3 generations could live side by side. Gardens for growing food together. A courtyard for celebrations and daily life. Space for everyone, privacy when needed, but always within reach of each other, and it had failed. Not because the design was wrong or the construction was poor, but because the people it was built for had looked at it and walked away. Elias's father had been the first. Roberto Navarro, who'd gotten a job at Sandia Labs in Albuquerque and moved his family to the city, who decided that modern conveniences and good schools mattered more than land and tradition, who'd brought young Elias back for summers only because his wife insisted, and who'd seemed uncomfortable the entire time, like he was visiting a museum of a life he'd deliberately left behind. His uncles had followed the same pattern. One to California, another to Texas. They'd come back for visits at first, then for holidays only, then not at all. Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, the slow fade of family ties stretched too thin across too many miles. And Elias himself? He'd left at 18, gone to work ranches across the West, chasing the cowboy life that seemed romantic and free. He'd called his grandfather maybe twice a year, visited even less. When Tomas would ask about coming home, about staying, about learning the old skills and keeping the homestead alive, Elias had always had an excuse. Next year, abuelo, when I save enough money, when I finish this contract, when I get settled. Except he'd never gotten settled, had never meant to. Staying in one place meant commitment, meant responsibility, meant facing the fact that he was needed and choosing to show up anyway. Easier to keep moving, keep working, keep telling himself that tomorrow or next year or someday he'd make things right. Interesting, no? Elias joked around. Doña Carmen stood at the edge of the courtyard, a basket over her arm. He'd been so lost in thought he hadn't heard her approach. I brought you lunch, she said, setting the basket down. You didn't come to the village today, so I thought you might be hungry. Thank you. Elias's voice came out rough. He cleared his throat. I found these, the plans. Did you know that he built it for all of you? Yes, mijo. Everyone knew. Your grandfather talked about it constantly. 3 houses for 3 sons and their families. Room for everyone to grow old together, to raise children together, to help each other. She looked around at the ruins. He finished the buildings in 1951. By 1955, he was living here alone. Your father sent money sometimes, but money wasn't what Tomas needed. Why did they leave? Elias asked, though he knew the answer. Why does anyone leave? Better opportunities, bigger dreams, the belief that somewhere else must be better than here. And maybe it was better for them. Maybe your father's life in Albuquerque was richer than anything he could have had here. But something was lost too. Something always is. She looked at him steadily. Why are you here, Elias? What do you hope to find in these ruins? He couldn't answer. Didn't have the words for what he was feeling. Doña Carmen waited, patient as stone, until finally he said, I want to rebuild it, exactly as he designed it. All 3 houses, the courtyard, everything. She didn't laugh, though he expected her to. Instead, she nodded slowly. That's a big undertaking for one man. I know. Do you have money for materials? Some, maybe $8,000. Do you know how to build with adobe? No. Do you have help? No. Doña Carmen smiled, sad and knowing. Then you're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. She gestured at the blueprints. But maybe that's what this place needs. Someone brave enough or foolish enough to try. After she left, Elias sat with the blueprints for a long time. The afternoon heat built and built until sweat ran down his back and the paper felt hot under his hands. He looked at his grandfather's careful drawings, at the notes in the margins, at the vision of family and belonging rendered in ink and hope. He'd told Doña Carmen he wanted to rebuild it, but now, faced with the actual scope of the project, doubt crept in. He was nearly 60 years old. He had no construction experience beyond basic ranch repairs. His savings would barely cover materials, let alone pay for help or equipment. The village thought he was crazy. Benny had made that clear, and others would too once word spread. And even if he somehow managed to rebuild these structures, who would live in them? His daughter wouldn't speak to him. His father was dead. The extended family had scattered to the winds decades ago. He'd be restoring something beautiful and letting it stand empty, just like his grandfather had. But maybe that was all right. Maybe the point wasn't whether anyone ever lived here. Maybe the point was honoring what had been attempted, what had been offered. His grandfather had built these houses as an act of faith and love, and they deserved better than to crumble into dust. Elias rolled up the blueprints carefully and carried them to the stable where they'd be safe. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, he walked to each of the three structures, really looking at them for the first time, not as ruins, but as buildings that could be saved. The walls were thick, the foundations still mostly solid. With work, with time, with enough stubbornness, it could be done. That evening he drove to the village and found Benny Cordova closing up the hardware store. "I need to talk to you about materials," Elias said. "A lot of materials." Benny listened to his plans with increasing incredulity. "You want to restore all three buildings? By yourself?" "That's right. You got any idea what that'll cost? What it'll take?" "Some idea. Not enough, probably. But I'm going to do it anyway." Benny shook his head. "You're crazy, you know that? Those buildings have been falling down for 50 years. You think you can just—" "My grandfather built them once," Elias said quietly. "I can rebuild them. Your grandfather had help. Had family to help him. I'll figure it out." Benny looked at him for a long moment, then sighed. "All right. It's your money to waste. Come back tomorrow, and we'll talk numbers." As Elias drove back to the homestead, the desert landscape painted purple and gold by the setting sun, he felt something shift inside him. Fear, yes. Doubt, certainly. But also a strange sense of rightness, of purpose. For the first time in his adult life, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. His grandfather's dream had died here in these ruins. But dreams, like buildings, could be restored. It would take everything Elias had, every dollar, every hour, every ounce of strength left in his aging body. But maybe, just maybe, that's what redemption looked like. Not a single moment of transformation, but 1,000 days of showing up and doing the work, even when no one believed it was possible. The morning after finding the blueprints, Elias woke with purpose. He spread the plans across the hood of his truck and began making lists. Not just materials, though he'd need those, but skills he didn't have, knowledge he'd need to acquire, questions that needed answers before he could even start. He spent the first hours taking inventory, walking through each structure with a notebook, marking what could be salvaged and what was lost. The original adobe bricks, where they hadn't completely eroded, were still good, thick and solid, made from the local clay and straw mix that had proven itself over centuries. Many of the vigas showed rot at the ends where they'd been exposed to weather, but the interior spans remained sound. Iron fixtures, hinges, latches, decorative grillwork lay scattered but intact, needing only cleaning and oil. But Elias realized quickly that he was staring at a puzzle he didn't know how to solve. He'd framed buildings before, done basic carpentry, but adobe construction was its own art. The traditional methods, the proper ratios of mud to straw to sand, the techniques for laying bricks and finishing walls. This was knowledge he didn't possess. By mid-morning, he was back at Doña Carmen's door. She welcomed him in with a knowing smile, as if she'd been expecting this visit. "You need help," she said. "Not a question. I need someone to teach me. Someone who knows the old ways of building. There's only one man left in Tierra Antigua who worked with your grandfather. Esteban Lucero. He's 81 now, lives alone on the east side of the village. Whether he'll help you," she shrugged. "Esteban can be difficult, but he's the best mason I ever saw. And he learned from your abuelo. She gave him directions and sent him off with a warning. Don't expect him to make it easy for you." Esteban Lucero's house was a small, immaculate adobe with a garden that put the rest of the village to shame. Tomatoes, peppers, squash, all thriving in neat rows. Elias found the old man on his knees, working compost into the soil, with hands that looked like gnarled tree roots. Esteban Lucero. The man didn't look up. "Depends on who's asking." Elías Navarro. Tomás Navarro's grandson. Now Esteban turned, squinting up at him. The old man's face was a roadmap of sun and time, but his eyes were sharp. "I heard you were back. Heard you were planning to restore the homestead," he snorted. "Foolishness. Maybe," Elias admitted. "But I'm going to try anyway. Doña Carmen said you worked with my grandfather, that you knew how he built. I know how everyone used to build, before they forgot. Before they started buying those concrete blocks and calling it adobe." Esteban stood slowly, joints audibly complaining. "What makes you think you can do this? You ever laid adobe brick in your life?" "No, sir. You know how to mix mud? How to judge when it's ready? How to cure bricks so they don't crack?" "No, sir. That's why I'm here. I need someone to teach me." Esteban studied him for a long moment. "Why? Why now after all these years? Your grandfather's been dead 15 years. Your father never cared about that place. Why do you?" It was the same question everyone asked, and Elias still didn't have a good answer. But he tried. "Because it deserves better than to fall down and disappear. Because my grandfather built something meaningful, and I let it rot. Because I'm 59 years old, and I've never finished anything important in my life, and maybe it's time I tried." Something shifted in Esteban's expression. "Show me the plans." Elias had brought them tucked carefully in a tube. He spread the blueprints on Esteban's porch and watched the old man's face transform. The skepticism fell away, replaced by something deeper, recognition, memory, maybe sorrow. "I remember when he drew these," Esteban said softly, fingers tracing the lines. "We sat right here on this porch, and he showed me what he wanted to build. I told him it was too much, too ambitious. He said dreams should be big enough to scare you, or they're not worth having." He looked up at Elias. "I helped him build it, you know. The whole compound. Took us 3 years, working whenever we could. Best work I ever did. Will you help me rebuild it?" Esteban was quiet for so long Elias thought he'd refuse. Then, "I'm too old to do the heavy work anymore. My back won't allow it. But I can teach you if you're serious. If you're willing to do it the right way. Not take shortcuts, not give up when it gets hard. Can you promise me that?" "I can promise I'll try. Trying isn't good enough. You either commit to this or you don't." Elias met his eyes. "I commit," Esteban nodded slowly. "Then we start tomorrow, early before it gets too hot. And you better have a strong back, because making adobe bricks is hard work." The lessons began the next morning at dawn. Esteban showed him the clay deposits his grandfather had used, explained how to test the soil for the right composition. Too much clay and the bricks would crack. Too much sand and they'd crumble. The ratio mattered, and you learned it by feel more than measurement. They spent days just preparing the mud, mixing clay, sand and straw in a shallow pit, adding water gradually, working it with hose until the consistency was right. Elias's shoulders screamed, his hands blistered and bled, but Esteban showed no mercy. "Your grandfather was 60 when he did this work. You're younger. You can handle it." When the mud was finally ready, Esteban showed him how to use the wooden forms, rectangular molds that shaped the bricks. Pack the mud in firmly, level the top, and mold it carefully onto the ground to dry, 1 brick at a time. Rows of them laid out to cure in the sun, turned regularly so they dried evenly. It was during the brick-making that Elias found his grandfather's tools. He'd been clearing out the old workshop, a lean-to structure that had somehow survived relatively intact, when he discovered them wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a wooden chest. Mason's tools, hand-forged and perfectly maintained. Trowels of different sizes, their wooden handles worn smooth by decades of use. A plumb line with a brass weight. Levels, chisels, brushes for finishing work. Each tool had been cleaned and oiled before being stored, as if Tomas had known they'd be needed again someday. Elias held a trowel, felt its weight and balance, and was suddenly 8 years old again. Summer afternoon, watching his grandfather work on a low garden wall. The old man's hands moving with practiced grace, laying brick after brick. Talking about how adobe was more than building material, it was earth itself, transformed and made useful. "You paying attention, mijo? Someday you might need to know this." But Elias hadn't paid attention, not really. He'd been more interested in the horses, in playing, in anything except standing still and learning patience. Now he wished he could go back to that boy and make him watch, make him listen, make him understand that this knowledge was a gift being offered. "Those are good tools," Esteban said, appearing beside him. Tomas took care of his equipment, said a craftsman was only as good as his tools and his attention to detail. He picked up a trowel, examined it. "I helped him forge some of these, back when we were young and thought we'd live forever." Over the following weeks, as Elias learned and worked, a routine developed. Doña Carmen would bring food, tamales, pozole, fresh bread, refusing his offers of payment. "You're doing something good here," she'd say. "This is my part." Father Miguel stopped by regularly after evening mass. He'd sit on overturned buckets and talk while Elias worked. Conversations that wandered from theology to baseball to the nature of redemption. One evening, as the sun painted the desert orange and red, the priest asked about family. "Do you have children, Elias?" The question hung in the air between them. "Finally, a daughter, Maria, but we don't speak." "How long?" 5 years. "Since I missed her college graduation. I was working a ranch in Montana, couldn't get the time off or—" He stopped. "That's a lie. I could have made it work if I'd wanted to. I just didn't want to badly enough." Father Miguel nodded, didn't judge. "And now?" "Now she won't return my calls. I stopped trying about 2 years ago. Figured she'd made her choice. Or maybe she figured you'd made yours." The priest stood, dusted off his pants. "You know, Elias, rebuilding these houses is noble work. But you can't restore a building and leave relationships in ruins. At some point, you'll need to face that too." The words stayed with Elias after the priest left. That night, by lantern light, he started his own journal. Not as eloquent as his grandfather's, not as profound. Just daily entries about the work, what he learned, what he struggled with. And at the end of the first entry, a single line, "Tomorrow I will write to Maria. I will find the courage to try." But he didn't write the next day or the day after. The work consumed him. There was always more to do, always another brick to make, another section to clear. The promise lingered, unmet, like so many promises before it. Still, the rows of drying adobe bricks grew. His hands became harder, his back stronger. The compound began to look less like a ruin and more like a project in progress. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. And somewhere in those exhausting, purposeful days, Elias began to feel something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility that he might actually be building towards something instead of running away from it. 3 weeks into the restoration, Elias could see the transformation in himself as much as in the homestead. His hands, once blistered and raw, had toughened into calloused tools. His back still ached each morning, but it was the good ache of honest labor, not the hollow pain of age and regret. He'd fallen into a rhythm, up at dawn, work until the midday heat became dangerous, rest in the shade of the cottonwood, then back to work until the sun dropped behind the mountains. The debris was cleared now, sorted into piles of salvage and waste. Hundreds of adobe bricks lay curing in neat rows across what would become the courtyard. The foundations had been exposed, inspected, and in some places repaired. The homestead was beginning to look less like a forgotten ruin and more like a construction site, a place where something was being built rather than allowed to die. It was during a break from mixing mud that Elias found the photograph. He'd been sorting through personal items in one of the smaller structures, separating trash from anything worth keeping, when he noticed a cracked picture frame wedged between 2 fallen vigas. The glass was shattered, the frame warped by water and time, but the photograph inside was remarkably intact, protected perhaps by its very entombment. The image showed the homestead in its glory days. The 3 adobe buildings stood proud and whole, their walls plastered smooth and painted white, their roofs intact and solid. But it was the people that caught Elias's breath. The entire Navarro family, 3 generations gathered in the courtyard. His grandfather, Tomas, stood at the center, younger then, maybe in his 50s, strong and vital. Around him, 3 sons with their wives, a daughter and children everywhere. Cousins Elias had never met or couldn't remember. Faces that carried the family resemblance, the same dark eyes, the same strong features, and there on his grandfather's shoulders, a small boy grinning at the camera. Elías himself, maybe 5 years old, his tiny hands gripping his abuelo's head for balance. He had no memory of that moment, of that day, but the photograph proved it had happened. He'd been here. He'd been part of this gathering, this family, this dream of belonging. The date on the back, written in faded pencil, Navidad 1955, Christmas 1955, 70 years ago, give or take. 70 years since the entire family had stood together in this place, since the homestead had fulfilled its purpose as a gathering point, a home for all of them. What had happened between that photograph and now? When did the visit stop? When did Christmas here become too inconvenient, too far, too rooted in a past everyone was trying to escape? Elías carried the photograph back to his camp and set it on a makeshift shelf, just a board propped between two rocks, but good enough. The image became a daily reminder, a tangible representation of what his grandfather had tried to preserve and what had been lost in the forgetting. Esteban arrived each morning now, regular as sunrise. The old man couldn't do heavy work anymore, but he could teach, and his knowledge ran deep. He showed Elías how to mix the mortar properly, how to test its consistency, when it was ready and when it needed more time. They began laying the foundation for the first structure, the main house, the one his grandfather had lived in. One morning, as they worked side by side, Esteban talked about Elías's father in a way no one else had. Roberto wasn't wrong, to leave, to want something different for his children. The world was changing, opportunities were opening up. A man has to make choices, but he broke my grandfather's heart. That he did. But maybe Tomas's dream was too big, too demanding. He wanted everyone to want what he wanted, to value what he valued. That's a heavy burden to place on your children. To love what you love, to stay where you stayed, to carry forward your vision of how life should be lived. Esteban smoothed mortar with practiced hands. Your father chose differently. That's not betrayal. That's just life. The words shifted something in Elías's understanding. He'd always seen his father's departure as rejection, as abandonment of something sacred. But maybe it was more complicated than that. Maybe both things could be true. His father had done what he thought was right for his own family, and something precious had been lost in that choice. Late one afternoon, as Elías was cleaning tools, Father Miguel appeared with an unusual request. I'm teaching a group of teenagers about traditional crafts, about keeping skills alive. Would you be willing to talk to them? Show them what you're doing here? Elías's first instinct was to refuse. I'm not a teacher. Barely know what I'm doing myself. That's exactly why you'd be perfect. You're learning, struggling, figuring it out. That's more valuable than expertise. That's real. Against his better judgment, Elías agreed. The next Sunday, 5 teenagers showed up at the homestead. 3 boys and 2 girls, all looking skeptical and bored. But as Elías showed them the adobe bricks, explained the mixing ratios, talked about why these techniques mattered, something unexpected happened. They started asking questions. Good questions. Engaged questions. One boy in particular, a lanky 16-year-old named Mateo, lingered after the others left. This is actually pretty cool, he said, examining the adobe bricks. My great-grandfather built his house this way. It's still standing, still solid. Better than the new construction in town. Your family here long? Elías asked. 5 generations. But I'm planning to leave after graduation. Go to Albuquerque, maybe Phoenix. Nothing here for people my age. The words echoed with familiar patterns, familiar choices. Elías heard his younger self in them, that same certainty that somewhere else must be better than here. I get that, was all he said. Mateo kicked at the dirt, then asked, could I maybe help? On weekends. I don't know anything about building, but I could learn. And I'd work for free, just want to know how this is done. Elías hesitated. He'd gotten used to working alone, to the solitude and simplicity of just himself and the task at hand. But there was something in the boy's face, some genuine interest that deserved encouragement. All right, Saturdays, if you're serious. Mateo became his first assistant. The teenager showed up every Saturday morning ready to work, and teaching him forced Elias to articulate what he was learning from Esteban, to put into words the techniques and principles that were becoming second nature. He found he understood things better by explaining them, that knowledge deepened when shared. The village's attitude was shifting too, almost imperceptibly. Fewer people made jokes about the crazy old man trying to rebuild ruins. Some stopped by just to watch the progress. A few offered help, materials they didn't need, tools they weren't using, advice on where to find good supplies. But reality intruded in the form of numbers. Elias sat one evening with his notebook, calculating costs, and the math was brutal. The adobe bricks they were making themselves, but everything else, lumber for roof structures, windows, plumbing materials, electrical supplies if they wanted to run power, it all cost money. More money than his $8,000 would cover. Not even close. He stared at the list, at the shortfall, and felt the familiar weight of inadequacy. Of course he couldn't do this. Of course it was too big, too expensive, too much for one man with limited resources. What had he been thinking? But quitting wasn't an option. Not with Esteban showing up every morning. Not with Mateo coming every Saturday. Not with the village starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible thing might actually happen. That night, Elias called his old boss in Wyoming. "You still need a hand for cattle season?" "Always. You coming back?" "Just for 2 weeks. Need to earn some money. But then I'm done. I've got my own project now." The decision felt like betrayal, like abandoning the work just when momentum was building. But there was no choice. Materials cost money, and money required work. And work sometimes meant leaving what you were building to earn the means to continue building it. He told Esteban and Mateo he'd be gone for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Promised he'd be back. Left the photograph propped where he could see it every time he entered the stable. A reminder of what he was working toward. The morning he left, Elias stood in the courtyard surrounded by rows of curing adobe bricks, by the partially repaired foundations, by the tangible evidence of 3 weeks' hard labor. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was more than there had been. It was progress, however small. As he drove away, watching the homestead shrink in his rearview mirror, Elias made a silent promise to his grandfather, to the family in the photograph, to the boy on Tomas's shoulders, who'd forgotten what it meant to belong somewhere. He would come back. He would finish this, no matter how long it took, no matter what it cost. He would restore what had been broken. The desert swallowed the homestead as the truck climbed toward the highway. But Elias carried it with him, in his calloused hands, in his aching back, in the photograph tucked into his shirt pocket. The work would wait. The work would always wait for someone willing to do it. 2 months into the restoration, Elias returned from Wyoming with $4,000 and a body that felt every one of his 59 years. The cattle work had been harder than he remembered, the days longer, the cold mornings more bitter. But the money was good, and more importantly, he'd proven to himself that he could still do the work when needed. Mateo had kept watch over the homestead while he was gone, covering the curing bricks when rain threatened, scaring off some teenagers who'd thought the abandoned site would make a good party spot. The boy met him at the entrance, proud of his stewardship. "Nothing was touched," Mateo said. "I came by every day after school, just like I promised." The progress was still there, exactly as Elias had left it. The foundation for the main house was complete, solid and level. They could start raising walls now, begin the process of transforming horizontal expectations into vertical reality. Esteban arrived the next morning with renewed energy, as if he'd been holding his breath during Elias's absence. "Good, you came back. Some people said you wouldn't, said you'd take that money and keep driving. Some people don't know me very well." "No," Esteban agreed. "They don't, but I do. You're Tomas's grandson. You'll finish what you start." They began the slow work of building walls. Adobe brick by adobe brick, each one laid with mortar mixed to precise consistency, each course checked for level and plumb. It was methodical work, rhythmic work. the kind that left room for conversation and silence in equal measure. During a water break, Elias discovered the lintel. It had been stored in the workshop, protected under a tarp his grandfather had secured decades ago. Hand-carved from a single piece of ponderosa pine, it spanned 6 feet, wide enough to frame the main entrance. The wood had been oiled and maintained, preserved as carefully as the mason's tools, and the carving was still clear and deep. Navarro 1948 in strong letters, with decorative scrollwork at each end. "Your grandfather spent 3 weeks carving that," Esteban said, running his fingers over the letters. "Did it in the evenings after working all day. Said he wanted something that would last, that would tell anyone who entered whose home this was. It's going above the main entrance," Elias decided, "where it belongs." The lintel became a touchstone, a tangible connection to his grandfather's hands and intentions. Every time Elias looked at it, he felt the weight of what he was trying to honor, not just buildings, but a name, a family, a belief that roots mattered more than wings. As the walls rose, Esteban began talking about the next phase, vigas for the roof. Traditional New Mexico construction used whole logs stripped and shaped, laid across the tops of walls to support the roof structure. "You can't use just any wood," the old man explained. "Needs to be the right species, the right size, properly dried. We'll need to go to the mountains, find a sawmill that still does things the old way. You know such a place." "I know a man who knows a man. That's how everything works around here." The road trip happened on a clear Saturday morning. Esteban in the passenger seat, Mateo in the back, driving north into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The sawmill sat in a valley where ponderosa pines grew tall and straight, run by a family that had been cutting timber for 4 generations. As they drove, Esteban told stories about helping Tomas build the homestead, about the dreams they'd shared of creating something permanent in an impermanent world. About the years after, watching the family scatter, seeing his friend's disappointment deepen into something like resignation. "He had a daughter too," Esteban said quietly. "Rosaria. Beautiful, smart, wanted to be a teacher." He was silent for a long moment. "I courted her for 2 years. Thought we might build a life together. But she married an engineer from Albuquerque, moved to California, had children I never met. She died young, cancer. I went to the funeral, and I remember thinking how strange it was that I'd loved her so much and ended up knowing so little about the life she actually lived." The confession hung in the air. Elias glanced over at the old man, saw the weathered face carrying its own geography of loss and roads not taken. "I'm sorry, don't be. I made choices too. Could have followed her to California, could have tried to become something I wasn't, but I stayed here, did my work, lived my life. No regrets, exactly. But you understand now. Your grandfather and I, we knew something about loving what you can't have, about building for people who won't come home. At the sawmill, they selected 12 vigas, each one about 20 feet long, 10 inches in diameter, straight as truth. The mill owner, a man named Ernesto, who'd known Esteban for 40 years, gave them a fair price and threw in delivery. "Heard about what you're doing," Ernesto said to Elias. "Good work restoring the old ways. Not enough people care anymore." Installing the vigas required more than 2 men could manage. The logs were heavy, the work dangerous. Esteban made phone calls, called in favors from old friends, men in their 70s and 80s who remembered the traditional ways of barn raising and roof building. On the day of the installation, 4 other men showed up. They brought tools, ladders, rope, and an easy camaraderie that spoke of decades of friendship and shared labor. Working together, they lifted each viga into place, positioned it across the tops of the newly built walls, secured it properly. The work went faster than Elias had imagined possible. By mid-afternoon, all 12 vigas were in place, spanning the main house like the ribs of some great beast. The structure was taking shape, becoming recognizable as a building rather than just walls. Doña Carmen arrived with food, tamales and beans, fresh tortillas, cold drinks. What had started as work became celebration. The men sat in the shade of the cottonwood, eating and telling stories about other buildings they had raised, other projects completed or abandoned. They spoke in a mixture of Spanish and English, switching between languages as easily as breath. Elías felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but more than that. A sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. These men had come because Esteban asked, but they'd stayed because the work mattered, because tradition mattered, because helping someone rebuild what had been broken was worth an afternoon of labor. Father Miguel stopped by after the work party broke up, examined the progress with genuine admiration. "It's really happening," he said. "You're actually doing this, with a lot of help. That's the only way anything gets done. Nobody builds alone." The priest paused, then asked, "Have you reached out to your daughter yet?" The question landed heavy. "No, why not?" "What would I say? I'm sorry feels insufficient after 5 years. And telling her about this," he gestured at the homestead, "she might not care, might see it as me chasing another project instead of dealing with what I broke. Or she might see it as you finally trying to root yourself somewhere, to become someone who stays." Father Miguel smiled. "You won't know unless you try. Write to her, Elías. Tell her what you're doing and why. Let her decide what it means." That evening, after everyone had gone, Mateo helped Elías clean tools and organize the work site. The boy was quiet, thoughtful. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About leaving, yeah? Everyone I know who stayed here, they seem, I don't know, stuck. Like they settled for less than they could have had. But you and Esteban and those other guys today, you don't seem stuck. You seem like you chose this." Elías considered his words carefully. "I think the difference is intention. Are you staying because you're afraid to leave, or because you've decided this place has value? Are you leaving because you're running from something, or because you're running towards something? The geography matters less than the why. I don't know my why yet. You're 16. You've got time to figure it out." But watching the boy leave, Elías felt the weight of patterns repeating themselves. Another generation, weighing roots against flight, tradition against opportunity. He couldn't tell Mateo what to choose, couldn't make the boy's decisions for him. All he could do was show through his own actions that returning, rebuilding, and staying could be acts of courage rather than resignation. The walls stood solid now, crowned with vigas that would support a roof. The carved lintel waited to be installed above the main entrance, ready to declare the family name to anyone who entered. The structure was becoming undeniable, real, a physical manifestation of belief overcoming doubt. But late that night, lying in his bedroll, Elías confronted the question that gnawed at him. What was he building this for? His daughter wouldn't come. His extended family had lives elsewhere. The beautiful compound might stand complete and utterly empty, a monument to nostalgia rather than a living home. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the point wasn't occupation but preservation. Maybe keeping the dream alive even in empty rooms had value in itself, or maybe that was just rationalization. Maybe he was building a beautiful prison for his own regrets. He pulled out his grandfather's journal, read the familiar passages by lantern light, and found Thomas had asked himself the same questions. What if I build all this and no one comes? Does that make it meaningless? Or does the building itself, the attempt, the refusal to let go, does that have meaning even in failure? Elías had no answers. Just walls rising brick by brick, and the faith that finishing what his grandfather started mattered, whether anyone else ever understood why. 4 months into the restoration, the transformation was undeniable. 2 of the 3 structures stood nearly complete, walls solid, roofs framed, windows installed. The 3rd building had its foundation laid and walls beginning their slow rise. Elías had developed real skill, could work independently now, without constant guidance from Esteban. His hands knew the feel of properly mixed mortar, could judge the level of a brick by touch as much as by tool. The physical changes to the homestead drew visitors nearly every day. People from the village and beyond would stop their trucks, walk through the compound, marvel at what one determined man had accomplished with help from a handful of aging craftsmen and one dedicated teenager. The skepticism had transformed into something like civic pride. This was happening in their village, proof that the old ways weren't dead, that tradition could be honored and preserved. But it was what Elias found in an old trunk that shifted the restoration from obligation to something deeper, more urgent. The trunk had been stored in the back of his grandfather's bedroom, buried under collapsed roof materials. Elias had spent an afternoon carefully digging it out, expecting to find more household items or documents. Instead, he discovered letters, hundreds of them, organized by year and tied with twine into bundles, his grandfather's correspondence with his children, spanning 3 decades. Elias carried the trunk to the shade of the cottonwood and began reading. The letters started in the early 1960s, when his father and uncles had first moved away. Short notes at first. Dear Roberto, hope you and the family are well. The homestead is quiet without you. Please visit when you can. Love, Papa. As the years progressed, the letters grew more detailed but never demanding. Updates about the village, the homestead, the changing seasons. Gentle invitations for holidays. News about relatives. Questions about grandchildren. I've been saving stories to tell Elias when he visits. Does he still like horses? I have a young mare I've been training. Gentle, perfect for a boy his age. And the responses, or rather, the lack of responses, became clear from his grandfather's continued letters. I understand you're busy. Work is important, but we miss you here. The rooms I built are waiting. One bundle contained letters from the late 1970s, when Elias would have been young. Roberto, I sent a birthday card for Elias last month. Did he receive it? I worry the mail out here isn't reliable. Tell him his abuelo thinks about him and would love to see him this summer. The horses miss him too. Elias had no memory of those birthday cards. Had his father kept them from him? Or had they arrived and been set aside, forgotten in the chaos of childhood and school and everything else that seemed more important than maintaining connection with a grandfather 200 miles away? The later letters showed his grandfather's hope fading, but never dying completely. Another Christmas without family. I understand, the drive is long, the weather uncertain. Perhaps next year will be different. I keep the rooms ready just in case. Elias found himself crying, deep sobs that shook his whole body. His grandfather had never stopped trying. Year after year, decade after decade, gently reaching out, never giving up on the possibility that his children might remember what mattered, might choose to come home even for a visit, and they hadn't. His father had sent money occasionally but rarely visited. The uncles even less, and Elias himself, the beloved grandson mentioned so often in the letters, had made excuses, postponed visits, let months become years, become decades of absence. I was part of this, he whispered to the empty courtyard. I did this to him too. The realization settled like a stone in his chest. He'd always blamed his father, blamed the family's abandonment of the homestead. But he'd been part of that abandonment. He'd had choices, opportunities to visit, to stay connected, to honor what his grandfather had built. And he'd chosen not to every single time. That evening, Elias sat at the small camp table he'd set up and began writing. The letter to Maria had lived in his head for months, always too hard to start, too fraught with potential rejection. But the letters from his grandfather had shown him that reaching out mattered even when the response never came. That attempting connection had value in itself. He wrote and rewrote, drafting and discarding. Finally, simply, Dear Maria, I know it's been 5 years, and you have every right not to read this. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I understand that might never come. I just wanted you to know that I'm in New Mexico, at my grandfather's homestead, the place where I spent summers as a boy. It had fallen into ruins, and I'm rebuilding it. Your great-grandfather built it as a gathering place for family, a home where everyone would have room to return to. It failed because we all left and never came back. I'm trying to restore what was broken, not just the buildings, but the dream behind them. I don't expect you to care about this place or what it meant to him. But I wanted you to know that I'm finally staying somewhere, finally finishing something, finally trying to honor the people who came before me. Your kids have a history here, roots going back generations. Maybe someday they'd want to know about it. Love, Dad. He mailed it the next morning, hands shaking as he dropped it in the slot at the post office. Benny Cordova watched him with knowing eyes, but said nothing. The village's support had grown from quiet approval to active participation. Benny admitted he'd been wrong to doubt, offered materials at cost, and extended Elias credit. "Pay me when you can. This is important work." Others contributed too. Men helped with plastering walls. Women brought furniture they no longer needed. Tools appeared left near the stable with notes saying simply, "Might be useful." The restoration had become a community project, everyone wanting to be part of something that mattered. Doña Carmen took Elias aside one afternoon and showed him the collection she'd been assembling: dishes, linens, furniture, decorations. "For when your family comes," she said firmly, as if there was no doubt they would. "Doña Carmen, I don't know if, hush, they'll come. You build it, they'll come. That's how these things work." He wanted to believe her. Father Miguel organized a blessing ceremony for the structures. The entire village showed up, 300 people crowding into the compound, filling it with life for the first time in decades. Traditional prayers, sacred smoke from bundled sage, songs in Spanish and Tiwa. The priest blessed each room, each doorway, each wall. Esteban gave a short speech, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Tomás Navarro built this place with his hands and his hope. For 40 years it's been falling down, dying, disappearing. But his grandson has brought it back. Not just the buildings, the spirit. The belief that some things matter enough to fight for, to preserve, to pass forward. Whatever happens next, this place stands as proof that giving up is a choice, not a requirement." The crowd applauded, and Elias felt overwhelmed by the weight of their expectations and support. Later, Mateo found him sitting alone in the courtyard after everyone had left. "I've been thinking about what we talked about. About leaving, yeah? This work, learning the old techniques, seeing something built from nothing, it's changed how I see things. Maybe leaving isn't the only way to have a meaningful life. Maybe building something that lasts, that honors where you come from, maybe that's just as important as chasing new opportunities. What are you saying?" "I want to study architecture, learn how to build the modern way and the traditional way. Then come back here, work in this region, keep these skills alive." Mateo grinned. "Someone's going to need to maintain this place once you're done with it." Elias felt something shift in his chest. Pride, relief, hope. Even if his own family never returned, he'd passed something forward. This boy would carry the knowledge, keep the traditions alive. It wasn't what his grandfather had envisioned exactly, but it was something. Maybe it was enough. The structures stood beautiful against the desert sky, their adobe walls glowing golden in the late afternoon light. Interior work remained, floors, fixtures, final details. Winter would come soon, and work would slow. His money was almost gone again, and 3 weeks after mailing the letter to Maria, there had been no response, but the houses stood. The carved lintel declared the family name. The compound had been reborn from dust and determination. Whether anyone ever lived here or not, Elias had kept his promise to his grandfather's memory. Sometimes he was learning. That had to be enough. 6 months into the restoration, the homestead had become what Tomás Navarro had envisioned 70 years earlier. All 3 structures stood complete on the outside, walls plastered smooth and painted the traditional white, roofs solid and weather-tight, windows installed and gleaming in the desert sun. The courtyard had been cleared and leveled, flagstones laid in careful patterns. The fountain, which Elias had painstakingly rebuilt from old photographs, trickled water from a restored cistern system. Interior work was underway, but incomplete. Floors were poured in some rooms, raw concrete in others. Electrical wiring ran through walls, but fixtures weren't all installed. Plumbing worked but needed finishing touches. The bones were there, solid and true, but the houses weren't quite homes yet. Still, what Elias had accomplished was undeniable. Visitors came regularly now, some from as far as Albuquerque and Santa Fe, just to see the old Navarro place restored. Photographers wanted to document it. A writer from a regional magazine had interviewed him about traditional adobe construction techniques. But 3 weeks had passed since Elias mailed the letter to Maria, and there had been no response. No call, no letter, no acknowledgement that she'd even received it. He checked with Benny at the post office maybe a dozen times, each time hoping and each time disappointed. Maybe she moved, Benny suggested. Or maybe she just needs time. Or maybe she'd read it and decided her father's belated attempt at connection meant nothing after 5 years of silence. That seemed more likely. Elias tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that he'd done this for his grandfather, not for reconciliation with a daughter who had every right to keep her distance. But late at night, lying in his bedroll and staring at the stars through the stable's open door, he couldn't quite believe his own rationalizations. Father Miguel found him one afternoon plastering a bedroom wall, working with methodical precision that barely masked his distraction. "Package came for you at the post office. I told Benny I'd bring it by." Elias's hands stilled. "A package?" "Postmarked Colorado." His heart hammered as he cleaned his hands and followed the priest outside. The box was small, padded envelope really, addressed in handwriting he didn't recognize, but somehow knew. He sat on the ground back against the cool adobe wall and opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, fabric, soft and faded. He pulled it out, a baby blanket knitted in pale yellow and white. His mother had made this. He remembered now, remembered her knitting it during her pregnancy, remembered Maria wrapped in it as an infant. He'd thought it lost decades ago, thrown away or donated, or simply disappeared in the chaos of divorce and separate households. There was a letter too, several pages folded together. Elias unfolded them and began to read. "Dad, I got your letter. I'm not going to pretend the last 5 years didn't happen, or that everything is fine now. It's not. You hurt me deeply, and that doesn't go away just because you're finally trying to make amends. But I want you to know something that might change how you see what you're doing at the homestead. After abuelo Tomas died, and yes, I know you didn't make it to the funeral, Grandma gave me some of his things. Boxes of papers, documents, personal items. She said he'd wanted me to have them, that he'd left specific instructions. For years, I didn't look at them. I was angry about how the family had scattered, how nobody seemed to care about roots or history. I was raising kids and getting divorced and trying to keep my life together, and I didn't have time for boxes of an old man's memories. But about 2 years ago, I started going through them. I found his journals, like the one you mentioned. I found photographs, letters, and yes, I found the blueprints, the same ones you must have found. The plans for the compound, for the 3 houses, for a place where the whole family could live together. Dad, I've been planning to go to the homestead for over a year. I needed to see it, to understand if there was anything left, if there was any point in trying to reconnect with a place I barely remembered from childhood. My marriage ended last year. My ex-husband wanted me to move to Denver with him, to start over. But I kept thinking about those blueprints, about what abuelo Tomas had tried to build, about belonging somewhere instead of just existing somewhere. I have 2 children, your grandchildren, though you've never met them. Elena is 12, serious and thoughtful. Santiago is 9, full of energy and questions. They know about you, but only what I've told them, which honestly hasn't been much or particularly charitable. But they know about their great-great-grandfather, about the homestead, about the dream of family gathering together. When your letter arrived, I had already started making plans to drive down, to see what remained of the place, to figure out if there was anything worth salvaging, not just physically, but emotionally. Your letter answered that question. You're there. You're rebuilding it. You're doing exactly what I'd hoped someone would do, but never imagined anyone actually would. I'm sending you the blanket Mom made for me because I want you to know we're coming. Not to visit, to stay at least for a while, to see if this place my great-grandfather built could actually become home for us, to see if roots can be re-established after they've been cut, to see if you and I can find some way to be father and daughter again, even after everything. We'll arrive in 2 weeks. Sunday, November 12th. I hope there's room for us. Elena and Santiago are so excited they can barely focus on schoolwork. Santiago keeps asking if there are really horses, if it looks like the blueprints, if we'll have our own house. I don't know what to tell them except that we'll find out together. I've also been in contact with some of the other Navarros, cousins you probably haven't seen since childhood, if at all. I found them through genealogy websites and Facebook. Not all of them are interested, but a few want to visit, want to see what's being built. I thought maybe, if we're all going to come home, we should come together. I don't know if this will work. Dad, I don't know if we can repair what's been broken, or if the homestead will feel like home, or if any of this is a good idea. But I know I have to try. For my kids, who deserve to know where they come from. For myself, because I'm tired of floating. And maybe even for you, because your letter told me something I needed to know, that you're finally trying to be present instead of absent. See you in 2 weeks. I hope you're ready. Love, Maria. Elias read the letter 3 times, each time finding new layers of meaning, new complications and possibilities. His hands shook so badly the paper rustled. Maria was coming. His daughter, who he hadn't seen in 5 years, who had children he'd never met, was coming here. To stay, not just visit. And she'd been planning this before his letter, had been on her own journey of returning and reconnecting. The blanket sat soft in his lap, a tangible link between past and present. His mother's hands had made this. Maria had been wrapped in it as an infant. Now it had traveled hundreds of miles to tell him they're coming home. Esteban found him still sitting there an hour later, letter clutched in one hand, blanket in the other, staring at the 3 adobe structures as if seeing them for the first time. "What's wrong?" the old man asked. "They're coming," Elias managed to say. "My daughter, my grandchildren. They're coming here in 2 weeks." Esteban's weathered face split into a smile wider than Elias had ever seen. "Then we have work to do." The village mobilized with an efficiency that would have been impressive in any circumstance, but felt miraculous now. Doña Carmen took charge of furnishing the houses, calling in favors and organizing donations. Father Miguel rallied volunteers for the final finishing work. Benny Cordova extended unlimited credit for whatever materials were needed. Even teenagers who'd never shown interest in the project suddenly appeared ready to work. 2 weeks. 14 days to complete interiors that were only half finished, to make empty rooms into livable spaces, to prepare not just buildings, but a welcoming environment for a family, returning to roots they'd never known. But the physical work, Elias realized as panic and joy warred in his chest, was the easy part. The real question was whether he could be what they needed. Whether he could be a father to a daughter who had every reason to keep him at arm's length. Whether he could be a grandfather to children who knew him only as a name. If that, whether after 5 decades of running, of choosing distance over presence, he could finally learn to stay. That evening, standing in the courtyard as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and purple, Elias looked at the 3 structures his grandfather had built and he had restored. They were ready, or nearly so. But was he? Could anyone ever be ready for the moment when everything you've worked toward suddenly becomes real? When the abstract possibility of redemption transforms into the concrete reality of people arriving, expecting, needing. "They're coming home," he whispered to the empty courtyard. To the ghost of his grandfather, to the family in the old photograph. To whatever combination of fate and faith and stubborn determination had brought him to this moment, the impossible was about to become possible. The dream was about to have inhabitants, and Elías Navarro, who'd spent his whole life knowing how to leave, was about to learn whether he knew how to welcome people home. 12 days. Less than 2 weeks to transform partially finished houses into homes capable of welcoming a family. Elias barely slept those first few nights, his mind spinning with lists and concerns and the mounting weight of what was about to happen. He'd rise before dawn, work until the light failed, then continue by lantern and headlamp until exhaustion forced him to stop. But he wasn't alone in the effort. The village had absorbed Maria's return as their own cause, treating the homestead's final preparations with the urgency and care usually reserved for weddings or christenings. This was their story too, their proof that community and tradition could outlast modern skepticism. Doña Carmen appointed herself coordinator of the furnishing effort. She moved through Tierra Antigua with the authority of a general deploying troops, knocking on doors and cataloguing what each household might contribute. "The Navarros are coming home," she'd say, and that was all the explanation needed. People opened their closets, their storage sheds, their attics. A table arrived from the Martinez family, solid oak, seats 8, brought from Mexico 3 generations ago. The Lopezes contributed chairs, mismatched but sturdy. Old linens appeared, some embroidered with initials that didn't match Navarro but carried their own histories. Dishes and cooking pots, lamps and mirrors, blankets and pillows. Each item came with a story. "This was my grandmother's," people would say, or "My parents brought this when they first married," or "It's been in storage for 20 years. Might as well see use." The offerings transformed the empty rooms into spaces that felt lived in, layered with memory and meaning. Elias walked through the main house one afternoon and felt tears sting his eyes. Quilts covered beds he'd installed just days ago. Curtains hung in windows that had been empty glass panes. Rugs warmed floors. Kitchen shelves held plates and bowls and glasses. A rocking chair sat by the fireplace, cushioned and inviting. It looked like a home, like a place where people actually lived, rather than a museum of restoration. Doña Carmen did this. He asked Mateo, who was helping arrange furniture in one of the bedrooms. Her and about 30 other people. Everyone wanted to contribute something. The boy grinned. "My mom donated those curtains. Said they were too fancy for our house anyway, but perfect for this." The courtyard came together through similar collective effort. Esteban and his mason friends laid the final flagstones, fitted them tight and level, grouted the joints with care. The fountain, which Elias had rebuilt following his grandfather's original design, now worked properly, water cycling from the cistern through carved stone channels, creating sound and movement in the center of the compound. Young people from the village painted trim, cleaned windows, planted flowers in large clay pots positioned around the edges of the courtyard. Father Miguel blessed each room individually, moving through the houses with holy water and prayer, speaking in Spanish and English about welcome and new beginnings and the grace of return. The priest's presence sanctified the space, made it feel not just ready but sacred. But while the physical preparations progressed with satisfying momentum, Elias's internal state grew more chaotic with each passing day. Joy and terror alternated, sometimes within the same breath. His daughter was coming. He would meet his grandchildren for the first time. The impossible dream was becoming real, and he had no idea what to say to them. He found himself having long conversations with Esteban during water breaks, seeking wisdom from a man who'd lived his whole life rooted in this place. Elias struggled for words. "How do you make up for years of absence? How do you become a father again after you failed at it?" Esteban set down his tools, considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know. I never had children, never married. Maybe if I had, I would have failed too. Most men do in one way or another. We're not built for the kind of attention and presence that relationships require. We're built for work, for providing, for fixing things. Emotions, those are harder to understand than adobe brick ratios. That's not much comfort. Wasn't meant to be. But here's what I do know. You can't undo what's done. Can't rewrite history or take back choices. But you can show up now. You can be present from this moment forward. Maybe that's not redemption exactly, but it's something. It's more than most men ever manage." He looked at Elias with eyes that had seen 8 decades of human failure and occasional grace. "I chose work over relationship my whole life. Told myself I had time, that there would be opportunities later. Now I'm 81, living alone. No family to pass my knowledge to except one teenager and one stubborn man trying to fix what he broke. Don't waste the chance I never had, Elias. Don't be me in 20 years, looking back and wondering what might have been." The words settled deep, became part of Elias's internal architecture. He rehearsed what he'd say to Maria, tried out different opening lines, different explanations, different apologies. But they all sounded hollow when spoken aloud to the empty courtyard. Finally, he abandoned scripts entirely. Whatever happened would happen in the moment, and he'd either find the right words or he wouldn't. 3 days before Maria's arrival, Elias drove to Santa Fe and bought gifts for his grandchildren. He spent hours in stores, overwhelmed by choices, trying to imagine what a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy might like. Books seemed safe. He chose novels that had been recommended as age-appropriate. A wooden horse, hand-carved by a local artisan for Santiago. A kite, bright red and blue for flying in the desert wind. For Elena, a journal with a leather cover in case she liked to write. He second-guessed every purchase. Too childish? Too adult? Too generic? But he'd run out of time for agonizing, so he wrapped them carefully and set them aside. The mayor of Tierra Antigua stopped by one afternoon. A woman in her 60s named Rosa Chavez, who'd lived her entire life in the village. "We want to hold a welcome feast," she said. "For the Navarros." The whole village, proper celebration. Sunday evening after they arrive and have time to settle. Elias felt simultaneously touched and overwhelmed. That's generous, but no buts. This is important. For them, yes, but for us too. It's been a long time since anyone came back. We want to mark it properly, show them they're welcome, that this village hasn't forgotten how to celebrate family. So the feast was planned, which meant even more pressure, even more public scrutiny of what should have been private reconciliation. But Elias couldn't refuse the village's generosity, their genuine desire to be part of this return. 3 days before the arrival, his phone rang. An unfamiliar Colorado number. His hand shook as he answered. Dad. Maria's voice, older than he remembered, but unmistakably his daughter. Maria, hi. Yes. Hi. Awkward silence, both of them searching for words. Finally, she said, "I wanted to let you know we're leaving tomorrow morning. Should arrive Sunday around 2, if the drive goes smoothly." "Okay, good, I'll be here." "We'll all be here, actually. The village wants to welcome you." "That's nice." Another pause. The kids are so excited. Santiago has been packing and repacking his bag for 3 days. Elena's reading everything she can find about New Mexico history. They keep asking questions I can't answer. Like what? Like, are there really horses? Is the homestead as beautiful as the pictures? Will their abuelo like them? The last question hit him in the chest. Tell Santiago, yes, there are horses. Tell them both that, his voice caught. Tell them their abuelo can't wait to meet them. I will. Dad, I'm nervous. About this. About seeing you. About whether this is a huge mistake or the right thing. I don't know yet. Me neither. But I'm glad you're coming. Whatever else happens, I'm glad you're giving this a chance. See you soon, Dad. 3 words, see you soon, Dad. And Elias had to sit down, had to let the tears come. She'd called him Dad, not Elias or my father in third person, but Dad. Direct, personal, claiming relationship, even if it was fractured. That meant something. That meant possibility. The final days were a blur of frantic preparation. Every detail checked and rechecked. Pantries stocked with food. Beds made with fresh linens. Flowers in vases. The compound transformed from construction site to welcoming home. Everything ready for the people who would fill these rooms with life. But late Saturday night, unable to sleep, Elias walked through the empty houses by moonlight. The rooms were perfect, beautiful, more complete than he'd dared imagine possible 6 months ago. Yet he knew with certainty that structures alone couldn't heal what was broken. Adobe walls and finished floors couldn't repair 5 years of silence, decades of absence. The accumulated weight of choosing wrongly again and again. He sat in the courtyard, listening to the fountain trickle, watching moonlight paint the adobe walls silver white. His grandfather's journal lay open in his lap, passages he'd memorized by now, but needed to read again. What if I build this, and no one comes? Thomas had written, what if I pour everything I have into creating a home for family, and they choose to stay away? Does that make the building meaningless? Or is there value in the attempt itself, in refusing to give up on the dream, even when evidence suggests the dream is already dead. Elias understood now what his grandfather had known. You build in faith, not certainty. You create space for possibility, even when probability says that space will remain empty. You honor what you believe in through action, not just intention. He pulled out his own journal, added an entry by flashlight. Tomorrow they come. Whatever happens after, whether we find our way to each other or discover the gaps are too wide to bridge. I've kept the promise. The houses stand ready. The family name is carved above the entrance. The dream my grandfather had is no longer ruins and dust, but walls and roofs and welcome. The question isn't whether the homestead is ready. It's whether I am. Dawn broke clear and bright, the kind of perfect New Mexico morning that makes the desert look like promised land. Elias stood under the carved lintel bearing the family name, watching the sun paint the eastern mountains, gold and rose. The village gathered behind him, Doña Carmen and Father Miguel, Esteban and Benny, Mateo and his parents, dozens of others who'd invested their time and resources and hope into this restoration. Everyone wanted to witness the reunion, to be present for the moment when the scattered family came home. A car appeared on the distant road, dust rising behind it. Elias's heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. Everything, 6 months of work, decades of regret, his grandfather's deferred dream, converged toward this single moment. The car came closer, closer still, and Elias stood beneath the entrance to his grandfather's dream, trembling with terror and hope, waiting to meet his daughter and grandchildren and learn whether redemption was possible or just another dream built on dust and desire. The car approached slowly, dust trailing behind like memory made visible. Elias could see Maria behind the wheel, her face serious and focused. 2 children bounced in the back seat, pressing faces against windows. His heart pounded so hard, he thought the entire village gathered behind him must be able to hear it. The crowd fell silent as the car pulled to a stop directly in front of the carved lintel entrance. For a long moment nobody moved. The engine ticked as it cooled. Dust settled slowly. Time seemed suspended between what had been and what might become. Then Maria opened her door and stepped out. She was older, of course, 32 instead of 27. Her face had sharpened, matured, showed the lines that came from motherhood and divorce and years of carrying burdens alone. But she was still his daughter's face, still recognizable as the girl who'd looked at him with trust before he taught her disappointment. Her eyes swept across the compound, the 3 adobe structures standing solid and beautiful, the courtyard with its fountain and flowering plants, the care evident in every detail. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between wonder and wariness. Then she saw Elias standing under the lintel, and their eyes met. Neither spoke for a moment that felt like hours. What did you say after 5 years of silence? How did you bridge that gap with words? Finally, Maria's voice, soft but clear. You really did it. I had help, Elias managed to reply, gesturing to the gathered village. The back doors of the car burst open, and children tumbled out. Elena emerged first, 12 years old, dark hair in a long braid, eyes that took in everything with serious assessment. Santiago followed, 9 years old and pure energy, practically vibrating with excitement. Santiago saw the compound and shouted, "It's like my drawing!" He ran to his mother, tugged at her shirt, pulled a crumpled paper from his pocket. "Mama, it's exactly like I drew it. Look." The boy thrust the paper toward Elias, who took it with trembling hands. A child's sketch in crayon and marker, 3 houses arranged around a courtyard, stick figures gathered together, a sun smiling in the corner. Simple but accurate, capturing the essential truth of what his grandfather had designed. Mama showed me pictures of bisabuelo's plans, Santiago explained, bouncing on his toes. I tried to draw what it would look like if someone built it. And you did. You actually built it. Elias stared at the drawing, at his grandson's intuitive understanding of the dream. "It's perfect," he said, voice thick. "Absolutely perfect. Can I see inside?" Santiago asked, already moving toward the entrance. Are there really horses? Mama said you said there were horses. Can I ride one? Do they have names? The ice broke. Tension dissolved in the face of childhood enthusiasm. Elena approached more cautiously, stood before Elias with shy formality. Hello, you're our abuelo. I am, Elias confirmed, dropping to one knee so he was at her eye level. And you're Elena. I'm very happy to meet you. I know, the girl said simply. Mama told us about you. The words carried weight. What had Maria told them? What stories had shaped their understanding of the grandfather they'd never met? But there was no hostility in Elena's eyes, no fear or suspicion, just curiosity and careful observation. Maria stepped forward then, and Elias stood. They looked at each other, 5 years of hurt and distance between them. Then his daughter moved, closed the gap, wrapped her arms around him in a brief, tentative embrace. Thank you, she whispered against his shoulder. For remembering. For actually doing this. The village erupted in applause and cheers. The moment of private reunion became public celebration as everyone surged forward. Introductions, congratulations, welcome. Santiago was swept up by teenagers eager to show him the horses. Elena found herself surrounded by women wanting to hear about Colorado and school and what she liked. Doña Carmen took charge, directing people toward the feast preparations, organizing chaos into purpose. Father Miguel offered a blessing for the family's safe arrival. Words in Spanish about journey and homecoming and grace. Esteban hung back, watching with tears on his weathered cheeks. Elias caught his eye, nodded gratitude, and the old man smiled. Come, Maria said to her father. Show us what you've built. They walked through the compound together, touring each structure. Maria moved slowly, touching walls, examining details, taking in the care evident in every corner. In the main house, she found the 1955 photograph displayed prominently on a shelf, picked it up with wondering hands. This is what he wanted, she said, studying the image of 3 generations gathered together. All of us here together. For all of us, Elias agreed. He never stopped wanting it. Santiago discovered the carved lintel above the entrance, reached up to trace the letters. Navarro, 1948. What does that mean? That's the year after your great-great-grandfather came to this country from Mexico, Elias explained. He built this place as a home for his family. For all of us who carry this name, will you add our names too? The boy asked, turning with that directness only children possess. So people know we belong here? The question caught Elias unprepared, opened something in his chest. Yes, he promised. Your names belong here. Both of you. Elena found the bundle of letters on another shelf, untied one carefully. What are these? Letters, Maria said, recognizing them from the boxes she'd inherited. From your bisabuelo to his children. To my grandfather, your great-grandfather. She selected one at random, read aloud. Dear Roberto, spring has come to the homestead. The cottonwood is budding, and I've seen the first hummingbirds. I think of you often, wonder how you're doing, wish you could be here to see this. Love always, Papa. The children stood quiet, sensing something important in the words, even if they couldn't fully understand the weight of decades-long separation. And gentle, persistent hope. He kept trying, Elena said softly. He never gave up. No, Elias confirmed. He never did. And standing there in the home his grandfather had built and he had restored, surrounded by his daughter and grandchildren and the village that had made this miracle possible, Elias felt the full weight and wonder of what was happening. The scattered family was gathering. The empty houses would have occupants. The dream deferred for 70 years was finally, impossibly, becoming real. The feast spread across the courtyard as evening approached, tables laden with traditional foods prepared by the entire village. Tamales and enchiladas, pozole and calabacitas, fresh tortillas and sweetbreads, dishes that carried generations of recipes and memories. Music played from speakers someone had set up, traditional norteño, mixing with more modern sounds. People danced, told stories, switched between Spanish and English as naturally as breathing. Elena helped the older women serve food, somehow at ease despite being the newcomer. She moved with quiet confidence, accepting compliments about her helpfulness, answering questions about Colorado with thoughtful responses. Santiago was everywhere at once, asking questions, making friends, sampling every dish, his energy seemingly boundless. Elias watched his grandchildren integrate seamlessly into the village and felt wonder at their adaptability, their openness to this strange new world. During the meal, Maria sat beside her father at one of the long tables. They ate in companionable silence at first, then began talking, carefully at first, testing the ground between them. "I was angry for a long time," Maria said, not looking at him. "Really angry. About the graduation, but about everything before that too. All the times you weren't there, all the promises broken. You had every right to be. Still do. But then I became a mother myself," she continued, "and I started understanding how hard it is. How you can love your children completely and still fail them. How good intentions don't always translate to good actions. How easy it is to prioritize the wrong things." She paused, took a breath. "My marriage ended because I was too angry to let anyone close. I blamed my ex-husband for things that weren't his fault. Blamed myself for not being enough. But really, I think I was still angry at you and didn't know how to let it go." Elias listened without interrupting, letting her speak the truth that had needed saying for years. "Coming here," Maria gestured at the homestead, the celebration, the village. "It's not about forgiving and forgetting. The hurt doesn't just disappear. But I needed to come home, not to the place where I grew up, but to something deeper, to roots, to family, to understanding where I come from so I can figure out where I'm going." He showed her the bundle of letters from his grandfather, the decades of gentle reaching out. Maria read through them, with tears streaming down her face. "He never stopped trying. Neither did you," Elias said. "You brought us back. You did what I couldn't, what he couldn't. You gathered the family." After the meal, Santiago tugged at Elias's sleeve. "Can we see the horses now, please?" They walked to the small corral where Elias had borrowed 2 gentle mares from a neighbor. He showed Santiago how to approach them properly, slowly, calmly, letting the horses come to you rather than forcing contact. The boy's excitement transformed into focused attention, a kind of reverence Elias recognized because he'd felt it himself at that age. From the workshop, Elias retrieved his grandfather's old lariat, the rope Tomas had used for 50 years, braided rawhide, worn soft and supple by countless hours of use. "Your bisabuelo taught me to use this when I was about your age," he told Santiago, demonstrating how to coil it properly. Santiago tried, failed, ended up with a tangled mess. "Tried again?" His small face scrunched with concentration as he worked at the technique, determined to get it right. And in that determination, Elias saw himself as a boy, saw his father, saw the unbroken line of Navarro, stubbornness and persistence. Elena appeared from wherever she'd been exploring. "Can I try too?" "Girls can be vaqueros?" she asked with that same careful testing in her voice that suggested she'd been told otherwise. "The best ones often are," Elias assured her. "Your great-grandmother could rope and ride better than most men. She just never bragged about it." Teaching them both together, passing down skills his grandfather had taught him, Elias felt something fundamental shift. This was what the homestead had been built for. Not empty rooms and perfect restoration, but moments like this, knowledge flowing from one generation to the next, children learning who they were by understanding who had come before. As evening settled into night, visitors gradually departed, leaving promises to return soon. The family remained: Maria, Elena, Santiago, and Elias. Maria chose which of the 3 houses they'd occupy, began the process of settling in. The children explored every corner, claimed rooms as their own with the easy confidence of people who knew they belonged. Elias stood in the courtyard, watching light glow from windows, listening to voices echo from the structures, and could hardly believe any of it was real. Doña Carmen paused before leaving, put a weathered hand on his arm. "Your grandfather would be so proud. I wish he could see this," Elias said. "Maybe he does," she replied with a gentle smile. "Maybe this is what he's been watching for all along." Later, after the children were asleep in their new beds, in their new home, Elias and Maria sat in the courtyard, under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They talked about the future carefully, without promises, but with possibility. "I want to try staying," Maria said. "At least for now. Enroll the kids in the village school. Find work. See if this could actually be home for us." "There's room for you here," Elias said. "Always. No pressure, no expectations. Just room." She told him about the other Navarro cousins she'd contacted, scattered across the southwest. Some had expressed interest in visiting, in seeing what had been built, in reconnecting with roots they'd barely known existed. "Maybe we can really do this," Maria said, wonder in her voice. "Maybe we can bring everyone back, like Bisabuelo wanted. Not all at once, maybe not even permanently. But connections, family, belonging, maybe we can rebuild all of that." The weight and wonder of it pressed against Elias's chest. The dream was multiplying, expanding beyond what he'd imagined possible. His grandfather's vision might actually be fulfilled, not exactly as Tomas had designed, but in its essential spirit. A small figure appeared in the doorway of their house, Santiago in pajamas, hair tousled from attempting sleep. "Abuelo? Can't sleep, mijo?" The boy padded across the courtyard in bare feet. "Will you teach me to be a real cowboy? Like Bisabuelo was? Like you are. Every day," Elias promised. "I'll teach you everything I know." Santiago threw his arms around his grandfather in a spontaneous hug. "I'm glad we came home, Abuelo." Those words completed something in Elias he hadn't known was broken. Home. The child had called it home already, without hesitation or qualification. Not your home or this place, but simply home. Belonging claimed and accepted. The compound stood solid and beautiful around them. 3 houses where there had been ruins. 3 generations where there had been estrangement. A family where there had been loneliness. And in the center of it all, Abuelo Tomas's dream. 70 years deferred, but finally, impossibly, beautifully fulfilled. 3 months after the reunion, the homestead had settled into rhythms that felt both new and ancient. Maria had found work teaching English at the village school, a position that allowed her to be close to her children and contribute to the community that had welcomed them. Elena and Santiago had adapted with the easy resilience of young people, thriving in the slower pace and tighter bonds of rural life. Elena helped Doña Carmen organize the village library, cataloging donations and reading to younger children. Santiago shadowed Elias constantly, absorbing everything his grandfather could teach about horses, land, and the traditions that shaped this place. The compound had become what it was meant to be, not a museum or monument, but a living home. Routines formed naturally, morning coffee in the courtyard while the desert warmed, shared dinners where 3 generations talked about their days, evening conversations that wandered from history to plans to simple observations about the beauty of sunset on adobe walls. Elias taught Santiago to ride properly, progressing from leading a gentle mare around the corral to actual riding. He worked in the garden with Elena, showing her which plants thrived in this climate, how to read the soil, when to water and when to wait. Maria had begun documenting the family history, creating an archive of photographs, letters, and oral stories, a gift for future generations who might wonder where they came from. Other Navarro cousins had visited, drawn by Maria's outreach and their own curiosity about roots they'd barely known existed. The reunions were tentative at first, relationships fractured by decades of separation, requiring careful rebuilding. But one cousin, Carlos from Phoenix, had begun talking seriously about moving his family here, about occupying one of the other houses, about giving his own children the kind of rootedness that modern life rarely offered. Esteban remained a constant presence, having transformed from teacher to something closer to family. The children called him Tío Esteban, uncle, and he'd taken to the role with obvious joy. Mateo still helped with maintenance and ongoing improvements, bringing his girlfriend to family dinners and talking about his plans to study traditional architecture. The village had absorbed the Navarros back into its fabric as if they'd never left, as if the gap between generations could be bridged simply by showing up and staying. On a Sunday afternoon in late fall, Father Miguel suggested taking a photograph. for posterity, he said, and to honor what's been accomplished. They gathered in the courtyard, in the same spot where the 1955 photograph had been taken. Elias, Maria, Elena, and Santiago arranged themselves naturally, 3 generations connected by blood and choice and the work of reconciliation. Esteban insisted on being included. "I'm family too now," he declared, and no one argued. Doña Carmen operated the camera, directing people into position, making sure the light was right. The new photograph would mirror the old one. Same location, different faces, but the same story of family and belonging continuing across time. After the photograph, Elias retrieved carving tools from the workshop. With Elena and Santiago watching, he carved their names into a wooden plaque that would join the lintel above the main entrance. Elena Maria Navarro, 2025, and Santiago Tomás Navarro, 2025, their middle names honoring the great-great-grandfather whose dream had brought them here. Santiago traced his newly carved name with careful fingers. "It's really ours?" "It's really ours," Elias confirmed. "This is your home, your place. Your names belong here." Evening brought family dinner in the main house. Nothing fancy, just the simple food of daily life shared at a table that seated everyone comfortably. Conversation flowed easily, stories from school, plans for expanding the garden, excitement about an upcoming village festival. The extraordinary had become ordinary, and that transformation was perhaps the greatest miracle of all. After dinner, while Maria helped the children with homework, Elias stepped outside. He walked to the entrance and stood under the carved lintel, looking at the family name his grandfather had inscribed 77 years ago. He remembered arriving here 6 months earlier, the ruins, the dust, the skepticism, the impossible dreams that everyone said couldn't be fulfilled. Now, light glowing from windows, children's laughter echoing through rooms, the compound alive with the sounds and smells of family life. His daughter preparing lessons for tomorrow's class. His grandchildren arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to clear dishes. He pulled out his journal, wrote a final entry for this chapter. Redemption, I've learned, is not a moment but a practice. You can't restore the past. What's broken stays broken in memory. But you can honor it by building the future. My grandfather's dream wasn't about preserving something dead. It was about planting something alive, something that could grow and change and adapt while keeping its roots deep. I'm not the same man who arrived here believing he was alone. That man was carrying guilt and regret like stones in his pockets. This man is a father, a grandfather, a member of a community. This man is rooted. Maria appeared beside him, stood quietly for a moment before asking, "What are you thinking?" "That I finally understand what home means." She took his hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they'd rebuilt between them. "Me too, Dad, me too." They stood together, watching the New Mexico sky turn shades of purple and gold that painters spent lifetimes trying to capture. The compound was complete, but the story would continue. More family might come, more rooms might be added, more names carved alongside those already recorded. But the essential work was done. What had been broken had been mended. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but truly. From inside, Santiago's voice called out, "Abuelo!" "Come tell us about bisabuelo." "About when he first came here." Elias smiled, squeezed his daughter's hand, and turned toward the house. Toward light and laughter and the future that looked, for the first time in his life, like something worth staying for. The 3 adobe structures stood solid against the darkening sky, their walls bearing witness to everything that had been lost and found. The carved lintel proclaimed the family name to anyone who might enter. The fountain trickled peacefully in the courtyard, and through the windows, warm light spilled out into the gathering darkness, the warm glow of family life, of belonging, of home. A legacy had been reborn from dust. A promise had been kept across generations. And this ending was really just a beginning, the first chapter of a story that would continue as long as people remembered that some things matter enough to restore, to preserve, to pass forward with love.